All right.
Yeah, it sounds good.
It smells really good. Well, welcome everybody to Bible study. We are session 2 of the evening session um, for our Adventures of Paul. Now, if anybody has missed the first of our evening sessions, it is finally on YouTube. So you can go to our YouTube session or page channel where you are now, for those of you who are here. And session 1 is out there. We had technical difficulties last week. And so I couldn't go live last week. And then I recorded it live yesterday. So it's up there now. So if you are here with us, welcome. It's great to have you. It's good to have you. I'm here with me today. You can always come and be here with us live. But with me tonight is Karen and Dorothy and Megan, and so and a dog whose name I've forgotten. Mindy, and Mindy is here. So if you hear howling, whimpering, it isn't me, and it isn't my students. It's Mindy. She likes it in here much better than because it's carpeted, and I think it's probably warmer on her haunches. We were just in church, and she was a little unhappy. So if you are joining us on YouTube, always over there in the right sidebar, there is a place for you to write comments, questions. Hi, Rich Johnson. It's nice to have you with us. So you can always write any comments or questions you have down there, and eventually I'll see them. Sometimes it takes me a while to find them. So tonight we are looking at Philippians and the Thessalonian correspondence. If you have not taken, somebody else joined us. Hello, whoever you are. If you haven't, if you weren't here for the first session or you haven't viewed it yet, have no fear. What we talk about tonight I'll make sure that everybody's up to snuff and speed, but you may want to go back because I think there's just scintillating information in that first session. Because, well, I love the sound of my own voice. So tonight we're going to start by looking at Philippians. I will mention this, that if you want a really good map of the area, in session 1, in the notes under session 1, the video, there's a link to a really great map. I passed one out here in class, but it is out there. Or you can just Google Travels of St. Paul and you're going to get some maps as well. But the one that I like the best, I linked in the previous session. So we're going to start with Philippians and talk about Philippi and why Paul might have written this letter, and then the major theme from this letter. Let's talk a little bit about Philippi. First, it seems that Paul was never actually in Philippi. That he just he knew of the community and he wrote to them and he had a relationship with them, but it doesn't seem to be that Paul was ever there. It is the first European congregation that was founded. the first European congregation founded. It happened even before Thessalonians, which of course we're going to look at next. According to the book of Acts, the people of Philippi were actually converted by Lydia. Now, Lydia was a dealer in purple. She was a female merchant, which was more common than you would think in the ancient world. She was a dealer in purple, so she was probably fairly wealthy, and appears that she was head of her household. And we talked last time, last week, or yesterday, depending on when you joined me, about households, and that a household by ancient standards, and still in some parts of the world, is much bigger than a household today. I'm sitting here with two people who have households of two and one person who has a household of one. This would be unheard of in the ancient world. You would have a household of 20 plus people, because it would be the patriarch of the family plus everybody under him in the family tree, perhaps everybody, some elderly people as well, plus any servants and slaves. So it would be a large group. The great evangelical trick of the ancient world was, if you converted the head of household, then everybody else in the household had to follow suit. So if you converted one person, you would get 20, 25 people. It's quite an evangelism scheme. Of course, if that were the case, then I would be Baptist. So, and I'd probably be living with my mother. So there are drawbacks. Lydia was converted, and then she went back home to Philippi, and it's thought that perhaps she converted most of the people, or convinced most of the people in Philippi. So Philippi is not a big commercial place. It's more of a lazy sort of city, but it's been bestowed an honor by Rome. It is called an Italian city, Ius Italicum, Italian city. And this was an honor. It meant you got certain perks when you got named Italian city. But they would have all been under Roman law. They would have been Roman citizens. And like many towns, and Thessalonica, which we're going to talk about second half here, they would have been syncretists. Now, a syncretist is simply somebody who synchronizes stuff or adopts stuff readily from other cultures or other religions. This wasn't a big deal. So you might have people that were following the Greek gods and people that were following the Roman gods. And I might look at Karen, and Karen's big into Bacchus. Bacchus is the god of food and wine and fiestas, right? And I'm like, Karen, I'm down with that. So I'm on board. I'm going to take some of that stuff from Bacchus, and I'm going to use it in my own religious life. Or Dorothy might have a fertility god that she, right? Dorothy's like, what? And I'm interested in this fertility god because I want to be a little more fertile. And so I take a little amulet of her fertility. So there's not that it's not the same as the Jewish people who were not to mesh with other people. In the ancient Roman culture, there was a lot of give and take all the way around. One of the there were Roman gods and Greek gods. There was an emperor cult, so people that were um, really into Caesar Augustus as god. There was a Diana cult in Philippi, which had women priestesses. So women, again, Lydia and the women of Philippi were held in higher regard. Um, One thing that was not present in Philippi, Jews. There were no Jewish people. They were all Gentile. So that's a little bit about Philippi. Now, why did Paul write this little letter to the Philippians? Some scholars say it was a thank you note. He says thank you a lot in it. So there's some thought that maybe it was a thank you note. He also mentions quite often their partnership, their fellowship, their koinonia. Now, when we use the word partnership, we almost always think of a business, so sort of a transactional. And when we think of fellowship, we in the church often think about, having a cup of coffee and catching up. But really, both of these are the best English translations we have for this word koinonia. Koinonia, which has a much more personal and intimate sort of connotation to it. So there's a real intimacy when you use the word koinonia. So it includes, yes, having coffee, but it's not just chit chat, and it's not transactional. It's a very unique relationship, and it appears that Paul and the church in Philippi really do have quite a unique relationship. So he writes this letter as a way of highlighting that relationship that they have. It also seems that it's a news update on where Paul is. So if for those of you who were able to take the time to read Philippians, did anybody catch where Paul is? He's in prison. Yes, he is in prison. So he writes to the Philippians from there. Does he seem very put out about being in prison? No, he doesn't. He's like, whatever. It's all good. But he does give this news update to them and almost says to them, listen, don't worry. It's all good, right? And yours and my relationship sustains me. There's also a little warning about opponents, that there seem to be some opponents to the gospel. This could come because the Christian faith and what Paul was telling them was they needed to do things differently than what the world around them was doing. In other words, you couldn't keep your little fertility amulet and worship it. You couldn't hang with the Bacchus crowd. Once you were baptized into Christ, you put on Christ. And so this meant that the syncretism of the day, well, you can imagine, remember back to when you were a teenager, right? And conformity was everything. Now all of a sudden you're asked to be anti-conformist. Teenagers are brutal. They will get you in line. Now, of course, the thing is the conformity is to be anti-conformist. Like that's how, which is fantastic. So, there also seems to be some sort of squabbling going on. And this is the part of the Philippian text that I really want to make the most of because it is the most significant part of the Philippians, and that's something called the kenosis hymn. It's in chapter 2. So if we look at chapter 2, in chapter 2, there's a whole section there. Do you see the poetry? Right? So there's some poetry there. And this is called the kenosis hymn. Kenosis is a Greek word for empty, to empty. And it is thought that this hymn is the oldest hymn of the Christian church. And Paul includes it in this letter to the Philippians. Now we're going to look at this because what Paul uses this in order to set aside their squabbling. Because he says, listen, if you want to make my joy complete, then be of one mind. And here, as we sit in the week of prayer for Christian unity, we could learn a little bit from this hymn. What this hymn does is lay out what the cruciform life looks like. So I'm going to go over here to the board where I wrote something from earlier, but I'm going to go over here on the side. So the cruciform life, this is what we're talking about when we talk about the cruciform life. So when Christ came, and actually throughout biblical history and God's relationship, that doesn't work. I know the black one works. And throughout God's relationship with God's people, God always comes down to us. So if we want to know God, God always comes down to us. It's never the other way around. We're never going upward to God. God is always coming down to us. We can't make our way to God. We can't write ourselves to God. We can't think ourselves to God. God is always coming down to us. Once we get that primary action, then we can move outward in love. It's only after we have settled ourselves with this that we can move outward to our neighbors in love. And that outward movement is always cross-shaped. It is always sacrificial. It is always self-denying. This is what cruciform life means. It is not for the sake of making ourselves more important. It is not for the sake of glorifying ourselves. It is not so that we can get up to God. It is always for the sake of others. It is always sacrificing, and it is always so that we might be truer reflections of the sacrifice of Christ. So that's the cruciform life. Now, this hymn, if we look at any questions so far? Mindy is over there. Mindy has questions. She's not getting this, and she is whining her way through our Bible study today. All right. So as we look at the second chapter of Philippians, we can notice what happens here. It says, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness." So basically what we have is we have, I forget how I did this the other day. This is how I did this. So this is the symbol for Christ, right? It's a chi. The X is a chi, and the big P looking thing is a rho. That's the sign for Christ. Not a really bad stick person. So Christ empties himself. Notice Christ comes down and self-sacrifices and becomes a real stick figure, right? Becomes human. How many of you have played tic-tac-toe with a kid before? Yeah, right? Now, if that kid is like 5, 6, you can squash him every time. Like a bug. You can squash them every single time. But any good teacher or parent knows that if you do that, you will completely squash the kid. And so we limit ourselves. We know how to win. We know that we can win every single time because all you got to do is go to the corners. But we limit ourselves and we don't take the corners every time so that the kid will win. This is what Christ did. Christ, that poor Mindy, she is miserable. I think so. Must be my voice, my melodious voice. Maybe if I talked lower, then it wouldn't bother her. Nope, still not liking it. So Christ limited the divine self and became human. And so much so that in the end ended up on the cross. And that obedience then, God says, all right, you have limited yourself. And so now I'm going to raise you back up, so that at the name of Jesus, every tongue shall proclaim that Christ is Lord. So this is the hymn. And what Paul is saying in this letter is this is what your mindset should be. You shouldn't be looking to get yourself ahead. You should be looking at ways to limit yourself for the sake of others. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Sort of. If it does right off the bat, you're doing pretty well. Some of us go to school for a really long time and still just struggle with it. So the Christian life then is not isolated or individual. The Christian life is all about relationship with neighbor. All right. Before we move on to Thessalonians, which we're going to do at a breakneck pace, any questions, comments about Philippians? I promised you that this was going to be like a whirlwind through each of these books.
Made a lot of sense. I just thought it was funny at like 19 or something, where he comes up with whatever, like guy's name is Epaphroditus. It's like
Oh, in yes,
Timothy is, you understand that, but yeah, then he goes on. Yeah.
Epaphroditus.
Yes. Yeah. My brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier. He's also your messenger.
Epaphroditus.
Yeah.
Ditus. Yes. It's a good. That is a good Greek name right there.
Could you imagine mother calling him?
Epra. Do you think they called him Fro?
Biffwood.
What's that?
Biffwood.
Yes, Biffwood. Biffwood. We are referencing one of our members, Paul, is leading a book study on a book called Lamb, The Gospel According to Biff, by Christopher Moore. I had his last name. And so they were referencing Biff, Jesus' childhood friend. All right. Well, let's move to Thessalonians. So this is the this church in Thessalonica, sorry, is the second community founded by Paul. It was the second community founded by Paul in probably right around 50 AD, if you work in BC AD, or CE, if you work in BCE CE. So 50. And he founded this with Timothy and Silvanus. These would have been two followers of the way, of the Christian way, and devotees to Paul, probably disciples of Paul. So the history of the congregation and Paul's relationship with it seems from the letter that we have from 1 Thessalonians to go something like this. So Paul founds the community and then leaves. And then he hears, I don't know how, but he hears something. And so he sends Timothy back to the community with a message, something like, hang in there, keep on keeping on. Oh, Gail Goldsworth and Neil Goldsworth are checking in from the Caribbean. Oh my gosh. Well, I hope it's warm there because it's not here. And I understand that Florida is pretty darn cold too. So welcome, Neil and Gail, as you check in from the Caribbean. That's just cruel. So Paul sends Timothy in person back to the community with the message, hang in there, keep on keeping on. Then Timothy comes back to Paul and says, basically, Paul, they're doing all right, but they got a few questions about some stuff. And so then Paul, in response to this, writes 1 Thessalonians. Do you hear that, Mindy? She is just singing over there. We thought moving her by Dorothy would help, but nope. Like a minute it did. Yeah, I think it's my voice. She's just not quite sure who I am. So, what I'd like to do as we look at Thessalonians is really take a look at this behind me here. I don't know if that is backwards for you all too, but as I look at it from where I'm sitting, it's backwards. So, if it is backwards, I apologize. So, we're going to take a look. This is ancient epistolary form. We talked about this last week. If you want to know a little bit more about it, you can listen to last week's session. So we're going to look here. And as we look at the opening, this is how an ancient letter would have opened. It would have opened with a prescript that would have had the sender, which, if we look at Thessalonians, Shazam, there it is. It's right at the beginning there, I, Paul, right? And then it says, then you always say to who? And it says to the saints in Thessalonica. And there's a greeting then, right? Grace and peace to you. Yeah. Then every letter in the ancient world would have a Thanksgiving. Philippians had a Thanksgiving. Thessalonians does. How long does the Thanksgiving in Thessalonians go? It goes the rest of chapter 1.
Yeah.
Any further?
Well, it's sort of, yeah, it just sort of keeps on going. It's very,
So it goes on.
because it keeps being happy.
Yes. It goes on until the 13th verse of chapter 3. It goes clear to the end of chapter 3. So basically, chapters 1, 2, and 3. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 are Thanksgiving. How much longer is this than the Thanksgiving in Philippians? In comparison, there was not, right?
No.
So this letter, if you got a letter where 3/5 of it was thank you, how would you feel? What would you think is going on?
What does he want me to do?
Oh, you'd be a good Northeasterner. Like, what's he want from me?
What's going on? I mean, yeah. That's my first thought.
Yeah.
What does he want?
And yet he doesn't seem to want anything, right?
No. It's,
He's just really thankful for them, right?
yeah.
And as a matter of fact, what he's trying to do in this letter is to encourage them. And by giving them all the things that he's thankful for, he's thankful that the Thessalonians were chosen by God. He's thankful that the gospel came to the Thessalonians. He's thankful that they received the word that came from God. He wishes he could come for a visit, and he's hopeful and he's thankful that Timothy has brought back such good news of them. I'm going to go over and say hello to Mindy and see if this helps her. She is really freaking out. Mindy, what's the matter? Hi, did you want to come say hi? No? Is this the problem? Is that better?
We'll see.
All right. I gave her a little rub. Maybe it's just better when I don't talk. She's talking with me. Yes. Not about me.
No, not about you.
So,
I don't know.
what what Paul is trying to do in this letter is encourage the people to stay the course. They're coming under some sort of an attack, and again, remembering that Thessalonians, the city of Thessalonica, was a lot like Philippi, with the syncretism that was going on, and that they're isolated. And so again, Paul is asking them to be countercultural, and so as a result, they're torn a little bit about what is going on. And so Paul is using demonstrative rhetoric. And we talked about the 3 kinds of rhetoric last week. It's in session 1 video. But demonstrative rhetoric is trying to get people to say, yeah, you're doing a great job, keep going, or you're doing a crappy job, cut it out. And in this case, Paul's like, no, you're doing great, keep it up. Now, there are 4 things that Paul is concerned about in the body. So after we get through this Thanksgiving that goes all the way to the end of chapter 3, we have 4 issues that Timothy has brought back, 4 questions that the Thessalonians are wrestling with. And in the body of the letter, Paul is going to wrestle with these. So if we look at chapter 4, beginning at the first verse there, it seems as though the Thessalonians are struggling a bit with free love. If we look at verse 4, that each one of you know how to control your own body in holiness and honor, not with lustful passion. So it seems like they're having a little trouble understanding what's the appropriate way to conduct themselves. Now, this could be because so many of the Greek and Roman festivals included orgies. And so this would mean that they were participating in said things. There were also an awful lot of foreign gods that had temple prostitutes. And this is how you worshiped the god. So what Paul is saying is that when you become a follower of Christ, these sort of lustful passions need to be put aside. For God did not call us to impurity, but in holiness. If we back up to verse 6, that no one wrong or exploit a brother or sister. I think it's important for us to notice that this is about exploitation and wronging someone. So it's not about to consenting adults, right? It's about exploitation or just being uncontrollable in these things. On the flip side, the second issue is that they don't know how to love correctly. They're not loving in the right way. Again, we want to move back in some ways because Paul is always working with all of these things in his head, even though he doesn't say them to all of them. But we want to move back again, to loving neighbor is for the sake of the neighbor, not for your own sake. So I'm not going to love my neighbor because it makes me look good. I'm going to love my neighbor because even when it makes me look bad. Yeah. So those are the first two issues. The second two issues have to do with the return of Jesus. Paul was of an apocalyptic mindset. He was convinced that Jesus was coming back any day. And there was going to be a big upheaval, and the old things were going to pass away, and the new things were going to be there. So as a result, he probably has told this to the Thessalonians, and the Thessalonians, as they think about this, and that's all fine and good, but all of a sudden they're like, well, but wait, Joe just died, and Jesus didn't come back. Like, what does that mean for Joe then? Did Joe miss out? So they're very concerned about the people who die. And I think that this is probably one of the most quoted sections of Thessalonians, that for the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. So Paul's like, listen, you don't worry about it. Jesus has got this covered. If Joe died and Jesus didn't come back, it's all good. No, the rapture is in a different section. This is after. This is actually, yeah, this doesn't have rapture. This is just all about, yeah.
They wouldn't have a concept of heaven, and maybe Joe went and saw Jesus.
Yeah, no, that would not be at all. That concept of heaven is actually a Celtic concept. Yeah, that wouldn't have been an ancient understanding at all. Yeah. So so what we have is this sense of it's all okay. We don't grieve as others grieve because we know that there is another chapter yet to be lived out. This leads to the fourth issue, though, because they start to speculate, apparently, about when it is that Jesus is going to come back and how they might be able to tell. And Paul is like, cut it out. You're not going to be able to tell. You're just not going to know. So, in a sense, well, let me hold off on that. So really, we have four things that Paul has addressed here, but both of them have to do with loving neighbor in the appropriate ways, or two of them have to do with loving neighbor in appropriate ways, and two of them have to do with Jesus and his return. And then we get the closing of the letter with some exhortations there at the end, a greeting. But we get two benedictions in here, which is kind of fun. Again, I think that's because of Paul's relationship with the Thessalonians and how thankful he is for their faith. Any questions or comments about First Thessalonians? Here, okay.
Summed up with, therefore encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you were doing. So you just
Therefore, build each other up, just like you've been doing. Keep
keep on keeping on.
at it. Yes, yes. And one of the things that Joan pointed out at noon today is Paul seems so sweet in this letter. And I said, yes, he must have a very special relationship with the Thessalonians, because when we turn to Galatians, he's not as pleased with the Galatians as he is with the Thessalonians. Well, let's turn our attention to 2 Thessalonians. Did anybody get a chance to read 2 Thessalonians this week? You started it. Good. Karen, did you get a chance?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Dorothy, I'm going to put you on the spot then, since you're the only, at least started it. Did anything strike you about 2 Thessalonians?
I just thought it was a different than his earlier one, because he didn't seem to be as. He's got the body, he's got the whole thing sending it out, but it's like talking about the future, it seemed.
So,
What was more-
so
what would-
so you want to say that the mood was a little different?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm also going to read you something. Listen to this. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but only until the one who now restrains it is removed. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will destroy with the breath of his mouth, annihilating him by the manifestation of his coming. Sounds a little weird, right?
Yeah.
All right. So the thing is it is thought that this was not written by Paul.
Ah.
Yeah. This is what's called a disputed letter of Paul. And so as a disputed letter, most people think that he didn't write it. Some of the issues that crop up in 2 Thessalonians sound a lot like 1 Thessalonians, but more likely than not, it is pseudonymous, which is a great word to throw around. It simply means that somebody used Paul's name in order to write this letter. Now, in our world, you can't do that. That is totally not done. You cannot, I can't write something and say, this is from Martin Luther King Jr. Right? I can't do that. And if anybody were to attach my name to something that wasn't mine, I would be a little miffed. In the ancient world, this was done all the time. All the time. Now, most likely, this was some sort of disciple of Paul's. And there's this fascinating little thing at the very end of the letter. So if you go to 3:17, chapter 3, verse 17 of 2 Thessalonians,
Oh.
there's a postscript. Because there's this verse 16 is the benediction. So that should be the end. See, benediction, end. But then there's this little postscript. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. This is the mark in every letter of mine. It is the way I write. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Now, this could be one of two things. It could be this pseudonymous writer, could be him just saying, I'm going to prove to you this is Paul, and I'm just going to make his mark. Or he got Paul to read the letter and sort of like,
Say it's okay.
yes, and sort of like campaign ads. I'm Paul, and I approve this message.
Okay.
And this is how he approved the message. So, no, he didn't write it, but he approved it. Now, there's some stuff in here that I think goes against Paul's theology, but it could be he was late in his life and cranky. I don't know. So that's something you can stick in your back pocket. And when you meet St. Paul on that great getting up morning, you can say, okay, 2 Thessalonians, yours, not yours. Did you write the little postscript to it? Yes, no. You can hunt down St. Paul and ask him those questions. I am not convinced that Paul was completely on board with all the theology that is in here. There is specifically in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion, leading them to believe what is false, so that all who have not believed the truth but took pleasure in unrighteousness will be condemned. This is really not very Paul like at all. And so I am not convinced that Thessalonians even got the stamp of approval from Paul.
This doesn't cut it after the other one.
It's very different. Now, it could have been that Paul just got really tired of the shenanigans in Thessalonica. I don't know. But yeah, it doesn't make sense to me. Any last minute comments about Thessalonica and the Thessalonian correspondence? All right, well, the next time we get together, we have the Corinthian correspondence and Ephesians. It's a lot. That is a lot. If you get to reading it, perfect. If you don't get to reading all of it, I totally understand. But one of my hopes is that indeed you'll have read all of these letters by the time we're done. But that's a hope. You can live into that hope or deny me that. That's up to you. Any other last minute comments? For those of you who joined us live tonight, thank you so very much. I hope you found it informative. If you haven't, check out the recording that I made yesterday on session 1. It'll give you some interesting backstory on both Paul and on ancient society and letter writing and rhetoric. We'll see you all next week. Have a peaceful week and join us again either in person or right here on YouTube. Good night.